Okay, so you want to build a pyramid. You want to raise the most recognizable structure in human history. 2.5 million blocks of limestone stacked into a monument that has outlasted every empire that came after it. You think about the grandeur, the legacy, the sheer audacity of building something that would still be standing 4,000 years later. Very few people think about the payroll. Here is the number that puts all of it in perspective. At peak construction, the Great Pyramid of Giza required feeding, housing, clothing, and paying somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 workers every single day for roughly 2 decades. That is not a footnote. That is the whole story compressed into one number. Because the pyramids were not built by slaves. That is the myth. The reality is more interesting and far more expensive. The pyramids were built by a workforce that expected to be paid in bread, in beer, in copper, in medical care. They were built by a state that had figured out how to mobilize labor on an industrial scale and keep it functioning across 20 years of continuous construction. So here is the question nobody asks cleanly. What did it actually cost to build the Great Pyramid? Not in sweat, not in ambition, but in grain, in copper, in administrative overhead, in the sheer logistics of feeding a small city that existed for no purpose other than to move stone. The answer is not what most people expect. And once you understand it, you will see ancient Egypt in a completely different light. It starts with bread. Before we understand the economics of the pyramids, we need to understand the structural problem ancient Egypt had already solved before the first block was ever quarried. In the 3rd millennium BCE, the Nile Valley was the most productive agricultural system on Earth. Every year, the river flooded, retreated, and left behind a strip of extraordinarily fertile black silt. Egyptian farmers did not fight the land. They worked with a landscape that almost farmed itself. But abundance creates its own problem. When the harvest is good, grain accumulates faster than local markets can absorb it. When the flood is too low or too high, famine follows within months. The Egyptian state's deepest function was not military conquest. It was smoothing out that volatility, collecting surplus in good years, redistributing it in bad ones, and in the process building an administrative apparatus of extraordinary sophistication. By the time Khufu began construction of the Great Pyramid around 2560 BCE, the Egyptian state had been collecting grain taxes, recording transfers, and managing large-scale labor projects for centuries. It had a bureaucracy, it had scribes, it had a system of measuring, weighing, and accounting that could track the daily ration of every worker at a construction site and reconcile the figures against the regional grain store. This is the thing that made the pyramids possible. Not the pharaoh's ambition, not the availability of stone. The infrastructure of redistribution that already existed, the granaries, the scribes, the accounting practices, meant that feeding 20,000 workers was not a logistical leap. It was a scaling exercise. Egypt had already built the machine. The pyramid was just the largest thing it had ever been pointed at. The early evidence confirms the mechanism was working almost immediately. Papyri recovered from Wadi al-Jarf, the oldest papyrus documents ever found, record the daily operations of an official named Merer, who supervised a team of some 200 men, transporting limestone blocks from the Tura quarry to Giza. The documents are essentially timesheets and supply records. They track how many blocks were moved, how many men were deployed, how many days were worked, and crucially, how much food was issued. 40 loaves of bread per man per day. 5 jars of beer. That specificity is the first hint of something important. The pyramid builders were not drafting corvée laborers and issuing them the minimum survival ration. The quantities in the Wadi al-Jarf papyri are generous. They are the rations of a fed, productive workforce. A workforce the state needed to keep showing up and performing. The structural implication is uncomfortable. Egypt could build the pyramids precisely because its redistributive system was so efficient that it could sustain a non-productive workforce. People making nothing, growing nothing, trading nothing, for 20 consecutive years, and absorb the cost without collapse. That kind of slack in the system does not come from abundance alone. It comes from a state that has learned to extract surplus with exceptional precision. Let's run the actual numbers, because they are almost impossible to comprehend when you hold them against the tools available. Layer 1, the input cost. Quarrying and transporting the stone for the Great Pyramid required moving approximately 5.9 million tons of limestone and 8,000 tons of granite across distances ranging from a few kilometers to 800 kilometers. The granite for the interior chambers came from Aswan. In modern logistics terms, that is a specialized cargo problem. In 2560 BCE, it was a human and boat problem. Thousands of workers, hundreds of wooden sledges, and a river the state had learned to use as a highway. Egyptologists working from Merer's papyri estimate his team of 200 men moved roughly 2 blocks per day per team. At that rate, across the full 2-decade construction period, the logistics operation alone, separate from the quarrying, separate from the finishing, consumed millions of worker days. One worker day in Old Kingdom Egypt is roughly equivalent to a day's unskilled agricultural wage, which in turn maps to approximately $35 to $50 in modern purchasing power, anchored to basic caloric cost. That is a conservative figure, and it applies only to the lowest tier labor. Skilled stonecutters, quarry supervisors, and architects commanded multiples of that. Layer 2. The ongoing cost. The daily feeding of the workforce is where the scale becomes visceral. Bread and beer were not incidental rations. They were the currency. Excavations of the workers' village at Giza, first properly excavated by Mark Lehner's team in the 1990s, revealed industrial bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves daily. The site had large-scale brewing facilities. It had slaughterhouses. Cattle bones recovered from the settlement suggest that workers at Giza consumed beef at a rate that would have been extraordinary for any population in the ancient world. These were not people being fed the minimum. They were being fed like valued state assets. Lehner's team calculated that sustaining the Giza workforce at documented ration levels required approximately 11 cattle and 33 sheep or goats to be slaughtered every day. The grain requirement, extrapolated from the Wadi al-Jarf bread and beer figures, runs to something in the range of 4,000 to 5,000 liters of grain per day at peak construction. That grain had to be grown, harvested, transported, stored, milled, baked, and distributed, a supply chain stretching across the entire Nile Delta. Layer 3. The hidden cost. The thing nobody budgeted for, or rather the thing the standard account never mentions, was medical care. The workers' cemetery at Giza reveals a workforce doing extraordinarily dangerous work. Skeletons show evidence of healed fractures, spinal compression injuries, and amputations. And the key word is healed. These workers survived injuries that would have been fatal without sustained medical intervention. Egypt was providing trauma care. Papyri from later in the Old Kingdom period document physicians assigned to construction sites and ration adjustments for injured workers. The hidden layer of the pyramid's cost was a functioning, state-funded medical system keeping the workforce operational. The total annual cost of the Giza operation, across all 3 layers, in modern purchasing power comes to roughly $1 billion to $1.5 billion per year. Read that again. Not for the full project. Per year. Across 20 years of peak construction, that is a program cost in the range of $20 billion in today's terms, comparable to the construction of the Burj Khalifa, the Channel Tunnel, and the International Space Station combined. For a structure with no commercial return, no defensive purpose, no agricultural utility, the pyramid was the most expensive status object in human history, run by a state that had made itself wealthy enough to afford it, and that had built its administrative system on the assumption that the pharaoh's projects would always be worth the cost. Here is the structural problem with the pyramid economy's revenue model that nobody in the Old Kingdom fully solved. The pyramids were not investments. They produced nothing. A medieval cathedral at least housed a parish and collected tithes. A Roman aqueduct generated the urban productivity that paid for itself within decades. The Great Pyramid returned exactly 0 revenue to the Egyptian state. It consumed grain, copper, timber, human labor, and administrative capacity on a scale that had no economic justification, only a theological one. The flaw was not the construction cost. States have always found ways to fund grand projects. The flaw was what the pyramid complex required after completion. Each pyramid came with a mortuary cult, a permanent religious establishment that continued to operate indefinitely after the pharaoh's death, staffed by priests who drew salaries, held agricultural land in perpetuity, and were exempt from the labor and tax obligations that supported the rest of the economy. By the reign of Pepi II, late in the 6th dynasty, a reign that may have lasted as long as 90 years, the accumulated endowments of every royal mortuary cult built over 2 centuries were consuming a substantial fraction of Egypt's agricultural surplus. Not building it, consuming it. The land attached to royal and temple endowments was land the state could no longer tax. The buildup was invisible at first. 1 mortuary cult is a manageable cost. 5 is a rounding error. 20, stacked across generations, each drawing from the same agricultural base, begins to reshape the underlying economy. By 2200 BCE, roughly 3 centuries after the Great Pyramid's completion, the weight of these accumulated obligations had become impossible to ignore. The human cost of this structural flaw was borne not by the priests or the pharaohs, but by the provincial farmers. As the state's ability to extract and redistribute surplus declined, the governors of Egypt's 42 provinces, the nomarchs, began retaining more of the surplus locally, partly to maintain their own position, and partly because the central government's claim on their resources was no longer backed by effective enforcement. The farmers who had once delivered grain to royal storehouses found themselves delivering it instead to local lords. The redistribution network that had made the pyramids possible was fragmenting from the outside in. Around 21181 BCE, the conventional date for the collapse of the Old Kingdom, the center stopped holding. The precise trigger is disputed. A series of low Nile floods reduced agricultural output at the worst possible moment, compressing the margin the system needed to absorb its own costs. But the floods were not the cause. They were the stress test that exposed a system already running without reserves. The crisis point has a specific, documented face. A provincial governor named Anktifi, whose biographical inscription survives on the walls of his tomb at Moala, describes conditions in the First Intermediate Period with the kind of specificity that makes history legible. He describes marching through regions where people were eating their own children. He describes himself as the only functioning administrator in a landscape where the central state had effectively ceased to operate. These are not rhetorical flourishes. They are a provincial official documenting what the collapse of redistribution looked like from the inside. That inscription is the pyramid economy's honest balance sheet. The same system that had generated enough surplus to build the most expensive structure in human history could not maintain the structural obligations it had attached to that structure's legacy. The mortuary endowments drew on the surplus. The administrative apparatus drew on the surplus. The provincial governors drew on the surplus. When the floods compressed the surplus, there was nothing left in the buffer. The system that had no slack collapsed along the dimension of its greatest rigidity. The pyramid was not destroyed. It still stands. But the state that built it did not. By 2160 BCE, Egypt had not 1 pharaoh but 2, ruling from competing capitals. That is not a transition. That is a system failure. The Old Kingdom's collapse produced immediate consequences that cascaded across every layer of the economy it had constructed. The first consequence was the redistribution network itself. Without a functioning central government capable of enforcing grain transfers between surplus and deficit regions, the famines that the Egyptian state had spent centuries smoothing out returned with force. The Ipuwer Papyrus, a literary text that may preserve genuine memory of the period, describes granaries that had been broken open, the wealthy now poor, and grains scattered across roads. Archaeologists working Old Kingdom sites find evidence of occupation gaps, villages abandoned, cemeteries that stopped being used, the physical signature of population displacement. The second consequence was the knowledge base, the administrative machinery that had made the pyramids possible, the scribal training, the accounting systems, the logistics networks, was embedded in institutions that required central funding to maintain. When the central state contracted, those institutions contracted with it. The level of organizational complexity required to run a project like Giza did not survive the First Intermediate Period intact. When Egypt reunified under the Middle Kingdom, the state rebuilt, but the pyramid-building program that resumed under the 12th dynasty never again approached the engineering scale of the 4th dynasty. The Great Pyramid remains singular not because later pharaohs lacked ambition, but because the institutional capacity to repeat it had been lost. The third consequence outlasted the crisis by centuries. The fragmentation of the first intermediate period permanently altered the relationship between the central state and the provincial nobility. The nomarchs who had accumulated power during the collapse did not simply hand it back when reunification came. The Middle Kingdom was a negotiated settlement between a restored central government and a landed class that had learned it could function independently. That negotiation, between centralized redistribution and local accumulation, defined Egyptian politics for the next 1,000 years. The human accounting is stark. Population estimates for Egypt in the late Old Kingdom run to roughly 1 to 2 million people. The demographic signature of the first intermediate period is one of contraction, not catastrophic collapse, but sustained stress lasting roughly a century and a half, during which life expectancy declined, grave goods became simpler, and the infrastructure of the state, canals, granaries, administrative buildings, fell into disrepair. What replaced the collapsed system was the Middle Kingdom's more cautious model: smaller pyramids, more distributed power, and a welfare ideology in which the pharaoh was explicitly framed not as a god who consumed surplus, but as a shepherd who protected the poor. The theology changed because the economics required it to. The new system solved the problem of runaway mortuary endowments, partly. It created the conditions for the political instability of the Second Intermediate Period. The cycle continued. Here is the honest ledger of pyramid economics. On the asset side, the Old Kingdom built the most sophisticated administrative state the ancient world had yet produced. It developed accounting systems, medical infrastructure, and logistical networks that were genuinely extraordinary. It created a workforce welfare model: bread, beer, medical care, skilled wages, that contradicts the slave labor myth completely. And it left behind structures that are still standing after 4.5 millennia. On the liability side, it attached permanent, non-negotiable obligations to every monument it built, created an endowment system that grew faster than the economy that funded it, and built an architecture so centralized that when the buffer ran out, there was no fallback. Pyramid economics was not produced by exceptional ambition or unique historical accident. It was produced by incentives. The system rewarded scale. It rewarded permanence. It rewarded the accumulation of theological obligations that could never be renegotiated. Each step was rational, for the people making the decision. Each step was extractive for everyone outside the endowment network. So the next time you see a modern institution, a pension system, a defense program, a legacy infrastructure commitment that accumulates obligations faster than the economy generating them can grow, you are not looking at something new. You are looking at something very, very old. The Old Kingdom proved the concept. The question worth sitting with is this: how do you know, from the inside of a system that is still working, that the obligations have already outrun the surplus?